Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. And today is the sixth talk of our Spring 2024 online lecture series of the Inter-University Research Group on Tibet and the Himalayas, also known as Groupe de Recherche Interuniversitaire sur le Tibet et l'Himalaya, or the GRID, which is led by Isabelle Henrion-Dossi from here, Quebec province. And I'm very excited today to present you our speaker, Shannon Ward, an assistant professor of linguistic anthropology from the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, who is actually our first guest in this lecture series from the farthest point of on the west side of Canada, and hence Tibetan studies in Canada. Shannon studied Tibetan language and history at Columbia University and completed her PhD in anthropology at New York University. Over the past 10 years, she has been investigating the relationships between migration, urbanization, and language acquisition, language shift in multilingual Tibetan families living in Western China and North America. What I also would like to mention today is that very soon, in October 2024, the first book by Shannon, Amdo Lullaby, an ethnography of childhood and language shift on the Tibetan plateau, is going to be published, released with the University of Toronto Press, and it is now available for pre-order. So we're very happy that Shannon came to our lecture series first before presenting her book just in 8 days on May 9th. So we're very happy to have Shannon, and we're ready to dive into her presentation, which is entitled Documenting Language Change Through Migration, Tibetan Children's Language Play Between Amdo and Vancouver. I will now stop sharing my screen, and Shannon.
Yeah, I'll just get started here. And can everyone see my slides now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Natalia, for the wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to be here because this is the first time that I'm bridging my research in Amdo with my new work here in British Columbia. And I have some ambitious goals that are maybe getting us to think broadly about some common structures that are patterning Tibetan migration across the world and how these are leading to different patterns in children's language use. But I also want to show the relevance of using this method of interaction analysis to understand language. And so this might be relevant to some people who are also doing language documentation work in other varieties of Tibetan or other languages on the Tibetan plateau. So what I'll do in the presentation is I'll first discuss some commonalities in Tibetan migration patterns, and particularly looking at ways to understand Tibetan mobilities, both within China and transnationally as resulting from Chinese settler colonization. Then I'll talk a little bit more specifically about how some of the forces of settler colonization, specifically in economic development campaigns, are shaping rural to urban migration in Amdo. And then finally, when I move to Canada, I'm going to have us think a little bit about how Tibetan migration to Canada is also resulting from structures of colonization. So after I give that background, I'll introduce the methodology of interaction analysis to show why the study of everyday conversations is relevant to understanding Tibetan language. So it can do a lot of things that traditional language documentation and textual analysis can't do. And then we'll have the opportunity to look at some data from Amdo as well as British Columbia with attention to two key patterns in children's language use. So the first is their expressions of linguistic identity, and I'll show how this actually contributes to language shift in Amdo. And the second is language play and patterns of code mixing. And I'll show how these patterns of code mixing manifest linguistic continuity in Vancouver, even though Tibetan is generally not represented in public life in Vancouver, even less so than in cities on the Tibetan Plateau. And I'll talk a little bit about collectively what these data suggest about possibilities for urban language vitality. So, scholarly interest in language and migration is currently emphasizing not only linguistic diversity in cities, but especially the presence of endangered and vulnerable languages, including some varieties of Tibetan. And it's essential to think about how these languages are moving along with their speakers as we see a greater presence of Tibetans in urban areas throughout the world. So let's locate ourselves in Tibetan mobilities that are, whoops, there we go, that are grounded in settler colonization, primarily by the Chinese state. So in anthropology, when we talk about settler colonization, we're referring to a particular set of structural relationships involving resource extraction, territorial control, and attempts to eliminate indigenous peoples and their political structures. In the case of Tibet, this has involved the criminalization of Buddhism in general and monastic governance in particular. And in these structures have played out slightly differently in different regions of Tibet. So in Amdo, we can date these relations, especially to 1958, with the introduction of the Minzu Gaigo, or the democratic reforms that have been analyzed really extensively by Benno Weiner. In Lhasa, settler colonial relations were militarized a bit earlier than in Amdo, but they came to the fore in 1959 when they provoked the exodus of the Dalai Lama to India and the establishment of Tibet in exile. Since the late 20th century, though, within Tibet, ongoing economic development campaigns have been strengthening these colonial structures, especially by provoking rural to urban migration and supporting development campaigns in rural places. So the image here on the screen is of Xi Jinping visiting Ningxi in central Tibet, in the Tibet Autonomous Region. And for me, it kind of exemplifies these settler colonial relationships where the involvement of the Chinese state in Tibetan regions is framed as an opportunity for socioeconomic mobility. So, thinking about Tibet-China relations through the lens of settler colonization can help us see links between major migration events that are relevant to different regions of Tibet, vastly different regions of Tibet. So the first is when we look at the 1959 exodus of Tibetans to India, some of these people left along the route that includes Tawang, which is the site of a Buddhist monastery and current refugee settlement in Arunachal Pradesh. Then I know has been talked about a bit in this lecture series so far. In 1971 to 1975, there was a resettlement program in Canada for Tibetans that had involved negotiations with the Dalai Lama, and 228 Tibetan refugees came to Canada through this initial program. In the 1980s until 2008, there was continued outmigration of Tibetans to exile in South Asia. And after 2008, these migrations have slowed due to increased militarization of the border, as well as expanded opportunities for education and market employment within China. When I was most recently in Amdo in 2018, one of my interlocutors described it to me as Tibetans had lost the will to go to India. So there is an increasing orientation towards the opportunities that China as a nation state affords to Tibetan people. So alongside the kind of decreased desire for migration out of Tibet, there's been really rapid development campaigns in Western China that started especially in 1999 with the launch of the Open Up the West campaign, the Xibu Da Kaifa. And this contributed to rapid urbanization, both bringing cities to villages, but also encouraging Tibetans to move to cities. And one of the policies that has also interfaced with the Shibuda Kaifa is the school consolidation policy. It started officially in 2001, and it involved closing rural primary schools and building boarding schools in county seats. It was enacted in Amdo about 10 years later, and it intersected with enforcement of compulsory schooling in Amdo that had started around the early 2000s. And the school consolidation policy has been a major factor that's encouraging rural to urban migration. So many children who are attending boarding schools have family members who accompany them and rent apartments in the county seat. And many more families are choosing to move semi-permanently to cities to educate their children in Mandarin. And that brings us to 2012 to 2017, when the Dalai Lama again negotiated with the federal government in Canada to allow for another resettlement, this time of 1,000 Tibetans from the settlements in Tawang, Bomdila, and Tenzingong in Arunachal Pradesh. And this was due to political instability and poverty in the region. And most of the Tibetans from this resettlement program came to Western Canada, to British Columbia and Alberta, and they were partnered with private sponsors through the nonprofit Project Tibet Society. So the reason that I put these migrations kind of in conversation with each other is to show the complex and layered local histories that are interfacing with broader structures of settler colonization. And each migration is representing a local realization of a larger scale pressure for movements that are resulting from settler colonization and kind of the dispossession of Tibetan livelihoods across the plateau. So now I'll have us look a bit more in depth at two current migration contexts. The first is rural to urban migration in Amdo, and then the next is this Tibetan resettlement from Arunachal Pradesh to Canada. So in Amdo today, economic development is intimately intertwined with logics about child development, and we see this especially in family decision-making regarding education and socioeconomic mobility. Emily Yeh and Charlie Mackley have documented education policy as one of the factors contributing to rural to urban migration trends. And Yumji has more specifically shown how family decision-making surrounding Mandarin medium education responds to the school consolidation policy. So families see urban education in Mandarin as a pathway to social inclusion. But policies that are constraining rural Tibetan livelihoods can illuminate how these decisions are not free. They're rooted in state efforts for territorial control. So in the 2010s in Amdo, economic development campaigns forced or incentivized nomads to resettle in semi-urban housing blocks, and also created new restrictions on farming and grazing for farmers. And these policy changes meant that families must now supplement their subsistence strategies with market employment. And because these opportunities for market employment are greater in cities, many are incentivized to move. Although Sulek does show a really interesting example of how nomadism has given way to foraging for caterpillar fungus in Golok. So if you haven't checked out her piece on that, I recommend reading that as well. Despite the widespread belief that economic development is contributing to social inclusion, and this is a belief held by many Amdo Tibetans, economist Andrew Fisher has shown us that cities on the Tibetan Plateau represent the limits of geographic and socioeconomic mobility for almost all Tibetan people. So discrimination and the difficulties of obtaining hukou or proper documentation in central China prevent sustained socioeconomic mobility. Despite this, cities all across the Tibetan Plateau are becoming important sites of cultural production. And Andrew Grant gives a really in-depth case study of how this is playing out, how Tibetans are adapting and building their cultural practices in Xining City. So we can see these policies for schooling and economic development as examples of ongoing settler colonization, where the Chinese state is maintaining territorial control over the plateau and determining the limits of expressions of Tibetan cultural and linguistic diversity. So the Tibetan settlements in Arunachal Pradesh are separated from Amdo by 1,400 kilometers, by language varieties, by cultural norms, but they still have things in common with Amdo communities. There's still a shared colonial history that's revealed in Chinese state interventions, as well as the substantial efforts of the international community in supporting Tibet in exile. And the politics of aid to Tibetans in exile have been examined by scholars including Carol McGranahan and Anne Frechet. But some of the details of how this plays out in Tibetan cultural worlds in Canada include kinship practices. So kinship shapes migration patterns as well as the processes of creating belonging through multiple transnational movements. By the time Tibetans reach Canada, they've engaged in multiple movements. The Tibetans from Arunachal Pradesh have moved within India and also sometimes between Arunachal Pradesh and Nepal. The Canadian government actually considered kinship practices when they were making decisions about resettlement. So Logan and Murdy discussed government concerns that the close-knit nature of Tibetan kinship bonds would lead to social isolation. And although kinship figured in these negative evaluations of Tibetan suitability for life in Canada, the government ultimately factored in kinship when determining eligibility for migration. So one of the conditions for participation in the Arunachal resettlement program was that nuclear families migrate together. So they weren't allowed to send a single parent to Canada, who would then send remittances back to Arunachal Pradesh. If they were chosen, they had to bring their spouse as well as any dependent children with them when they moved to Canada. And some scholars, including Gutierrez Rodriguez, have described asylum practices in the global north actually as extensions of settler colonization. And the reality of Tibetan immigrant livelihoods in Canada makes this a really apt way to think about the asylum process. So the reality of Tibetan work in Canada is that many are working in service and care jobs, doing the essential work that the government is aiming to staff through immigrant labor. And the demand for immigrant labor in Canada, especially from Britain's former colonies, is actually one of the reasons that the Canadian state engages in refugee resettlement programs. And as many of you here likely know, these refugee resettlement programs are very rare. The vast majority of refugees globally are people who are undocumented and have very fragile legal status in this host societies. So language practices are not only situated in this context, but they also contribute to the dynamics of belonging and difference that accompany migration. And we can examine how the language repertoires of migrant communities change as they're adapting their cultural practices to new places and as they come into contact with new language varieties. The method that I use to do this is interaction analysis, and it involves audio-video recording real-time talk and then conducting line-by-line analysis. And it's an important method for language documentation more generally, and it stems from several key premises. The first is that language structures and grammar actually emerge through real-time interaction. So scholars who practice in this tradition believe that we can't really separate the language's grammar from the actual uses of language. And from this perspective, it suggests that language documentation actually requires interaction analysis, that you can't systematically document the language without documenting how it's used. The second premise is that routines, social routines, and these include genres of talk, as well as cultural practices that are coordinated with language, are sedimented and recreated through interaction. So each instance of interaction entails possibilities for reproduction and change. And each instance of interaction is also building on a cultural and linguistic history that participants are actually invoking when they speak with each other. And this methodology is relevant to several areas of interest in anthropology, but also across the social sciences more generally. The first is language socialization, and language socialization looks at language acquisition basically from a cultural perspective. So it analyzes how people become members of their communities as they learn language, and it relies on interaction analysis as the key methodology to analyze how language structures and language ideologies are implicated in people's process of socialization into their communities. And language socialization has historically taken a particular interest in children. And interaction analysis is really well suited to study the language use of children because they're still acquiring their grammar. They're still using language structures with more creativity than older people. And interaction analysis is the key method that we can use to really document how these creative processes are happening. Interaction analysis also helps us understand language mixing, and language mixing today is understood through a range of terms, including code switching, code mixing, translanguaging, and superdiversity. And each of these have a bit of a unique intellectual history, but they're saying essentially the same thing, which is that participants are drawing on grammatical resources from multiple languages in our interaction, and it's ultimately ideologies that are influencing how they mix structures from these resources, and that in the cognition of the individual, there's not necessarily a strict separation between language systems. And this applying interaction analysis to language mixing allows us to see how languages in contact may be actually changing through real-time interaction. Finally, interaction analysis is relevant to ethnography more generally. So broadly, ethnography is analyzing the production of culture, and interaction analysis allows us to link these micro settings of talk to longer term histories that can be traced through language ideologies. So ideology is ultimately the factor that's linking real-time interaction to broader structures, including social history. And when we conduct ethnography with migrant communities, then interaction analysis can help us conceptualize broader patterns of cultural continuity and change. So applying the methodology of interaction analysis to ethnographic research with Tibetans in Amdo and Canada reveals two key consequences of structures of colonization for children's cultural worlds. And these two are interrelated. So, as many of us, the linguists in this talk know, language contact is a constant in Tibetan communities. But what is a bit new is sustained contact with the major standard languages of English and Mandarin. And not just external pressure to adopt these languages, but actually interest within the Tibetan community in fostering bilingualism through strict separation of the two codes. And external pressures for belonging in urban China and Canada, as well as the community's interest in maintaining boundaries between these languages, have actually contributed to a reduced set of functions for Tibetan mother tongues. So increasingly, diverse Tibetan mother tongues are used primarily within kin relationships. But when we look at how children are mixing languages, we can actually see functions of these languages that are commonly overlooked and get kind of erased when we look narrowly at language shift. So when we look at interaction analysis with children in Amdo, we can see two primary ways that their mother tongue is changing. And the first is through code mixing and imaginative play, and the second is in forms of identity that are grounded in language variation. So in imaginative play, well, first I'll just talk a little bit about the research I conducted in Amdo. It looked at a particular mother tongue called Ronke or farmer talk, and the variety spoken in Solo Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture. And by comparing the repertoires of rural and urban children, so children who were in a village that I call Tachan and children who were in urban Xining, I found that rural children maintained multilingualism with Mandarin, but urban children mostly shifted to Mandarin and stopped using their mother tongue once they started preschool. But language shift is not inevitable. And one of the ways that we can see this is in their patterns of code mixing in play. So children actually demarcate different frames of play through Mandarin. So oftentimes they'll invoke Mandarin to enact a certain play activity, but then they'll switch back into Amdo Tibetan to direct the social organization of play. Urban children, though, are also reformatting the idea that language variation is grounded in place. And they do this actually by shifting to Mandarin. So when they use Mandarin, they're not just abandoning the Tibetan mother tongue, they're also claiming their belonging in the city, which they associate with Mandarin. So drawing on traditional cultural associations between language variation and place, they're situating themselves as city children by choosing to speak in the language associated with the city. So now I want us to see some examples of these processes. So we'll look at 2 examples of code mixing in Tachen, which is a village in Solo, and then we'll look at one example in Xining. So in this first example called sorcery, we'll see a 6-year-old child, Pamo, and she's using Mandarin to enact imaginative play, but then she's switching into her mother tongue to direct my involvement in the play activity. In the video clip and the transcription, Mandarin is transcribed in red and Amdo Tibetan is unmarked. Okay, so we can take this apart through several different steps that illuminate Lamo's demarcation of functions for Mandarin and the mother tongue. So first she enacts magic in Mandarin. She says mo fa, bie. And then she clarifies in Tibetan, being Loma dinso yomachok, really these ones aren't allowed to come. And then she begins sorcery again. So she repeats the Mandarin word sorcery. And then she explains, "Ni mofa chik shegore," I want to do sorcery. Then she starts to move locations and provide more explicit directions. So 8 lines later, she starts moving towards a plot of flowers. And then she does a magic trick through 3 steps. So first she says to me, "Chikta, dinso Eric, look, do you see those?" And then she makes the flowers disappear in Mandarin. So she says, "Mofa, mofa, 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 bie." And then she explains the results. So again, mariki, then you can't see these. So here we see Lamo using code mixing to move in and out of 2 frames of play. So she's enacting the sorcery and then she's explaining what she's doing. In the second example, we see a similar function of Mandarin, and we'll see Lamo with some of her relatives and playmates. So there are 2 distinct frames of play going on in this next example. There's 2 children, Dolkar and Tenzin, and they're coordinating a game of jumping off a ledge, and they're using Mandarin to make the act of jumping more playful. And on the side, Lamo is trying to recruit the other children to pretend to act in kinship roles. So to pretend to be a mother, father, or child. So we'll see this one now.
저 아마이네. 어.
Okay, so in here we see Lamo first asserting her desire to pretend to be the mother in Tibetan. So she says, "Doa ama ni ama shedugo, ama shedugo," and then overlapping her, Dolgar calls to Tenzin, directing him in Amdo Tibetan to jump from the ledge next to her. Tenzin then calls Ya as he walks over and climbs up the ledge. And then Tenzin uses this Mandarin phrase, "Ibe," followed by sound play pa as they jump. And Ibe was something that is used really commonly in these play routines, and it's something like ready, set, go. And I was talking just last week with someone from Amdo in New York City and who is like around my age, so an adult, and they said that when they were younger, they oftentimes use this same phrase in their play. So Dolgar and Tenzin mostly ignore Hamo, and so then I engaged with her a bit, and I asked, "Cho amayine, you're the mother," and Hamo says, "Na amayin." And then Dolgar and Tenzin continued to play with jumping. So Dolgar says, "Ibe hua," and then Tenzin repeats, "Ibe ho." And Dolgar climbs back onto the ledge and she's preparing to jump by saying "Ibe," while Lamo's calling out to the other children, pointing to them to direct who should be in which role. So she says, "E ochu shaire nga amare chu Tenzin hey hey." So we see here, like in the example of sorcery, the same clear demarcation of Mandarin and the mother tongue. So Mandarin is being used creatively, but within the limited context of imaginative play. So in each of these two examples, the children are using Mandarin in quite a limited function. So they're using the mother tongue to build their peer relationships and to direct the main social activity. But in the city, families have less access to children's groups of related peers. And oftentimes children may see their relatives only when their families are visiting the rural homeland. So in the next example, we'll see 3-year-old Sonam and his grandfather. And his grandfather is discussing their homeland, Tachen. And Sonam is expressing his preference for his urban friend, who he names in Mandarin with the kin term Gaga. Okay, so here, grandfather first starts the conversation by asking Sonam, "Ota Tachen Joji, will you go to Tachen, the village homeland?" And Sonam uses the mother tongue to respond to him. He says, "Tachen Manjo, I won't go to Tachen." And then grandfather tries to persuade him, "Tachen Jola Akocho Teki Terokyo. If you go to Tachen, all your playmates are there." And Sonam says, "Ga." So Sonam is showing that he can speak the mother tongue, but then in the content of his talk, he's explicitly rejecting the homeland and rejecting his relatives. Then he switches into Mandarin, the language of the city, to express his desire for his urban friend, in contrast to his rejection of his relatives. So after grandfather names Sonam's relatives in Sachen, Sonam says in Mandarin, "Buya, buya, wu goga." I don't want them, I want my older brother. And here he's referring to his friend in the city. And grandfather tries to persuade him, "Doa, doa, akocho chimti, tama, you know?" But Sonam repeats, "Booyah, wuya, wo guga." And then he actually tries to silence grandfather. So he yells at him, "Chao sula, it's too loud." So here we see Sonam is demonstrating his identity as a city child who belongs with his urban friends instead of with his rural relatives. So these two settings in Amdo are showing us that how children build their social relationships and their identities through language influences whether or not they continue to speak their mother tongue. So when children's identities are anchored in the city, they don't yet have linguistic resources in the mother tongue to articulate these identities. So when we think about how Amdo Tibetan farmer talk is changing, we can say that it's accompanied by relatively constrained code mixing in rural areas, but it's undergoing language shift to Mandarin in the city. But this language shift is the result of identification and ideology. It's not natural or inevitable. When we move to Canada, we can look at the same two contexts of code mixing in imaginative play and in linguistic identity and kind of trace these through children's language repertoires. So the community in Canada that we're looking at includes families who migrated from Arunachal Pradesh to Metro Vancouver between 2012 and 2017, and they speak Central Tibetan. Some of them spoke very standard Central Tibetan, some of them spoke varieties that were more similar to the languages in Hoka. And all of the families had one child who was born in India and had migrated with them, and one who was born in Canada. So what we see in this context is that children use much more extensive code mixing than in Amdo. So they borrowed words and syntactic features relatively freely, as opposed to just switching between routinized frames of play. And in the case of very young children who are working hard to communicate, they also use their knowledge of both languages simultaneously to make themselves understood. And in terms of linguistic identity, what's really interesting is that children define themselves as speakers of Tibetan, even when they make extensive grammatical and phonological errors. So now, Natalia, if you can just pause the recording because we're going to look at the videos. And so children's language use in the context of Tibetan mobilities does show us possibilities for urban language vitality, with attention to the ways that ongoing structures of colonization are formatting migration. Scholars have become interested in viewing cities as sites of dense linguistic diversity. So over the past 20 years, the scholarship had focused a lot on intercultural communication in major world languages like English. But in the last 5 years or so, in particular, scholars have started to consider the significance of cities to the revitalization of vulnerable and endangered languages. So, for example, the work of Ross Perlin and Dan Kaufman through the Endangered Language Alliance in New York City. And a lot of this work has been inspired by the presence of Tibetan and Himalayan languages. So what we can see specifically from the research with young children is that language shift in cities is not inevitable. We can view children's practices of code mixing as forms of continuity rather than rupture, because children are drawing on cultural knowledge when they mix languages. And so the use of multiple languages here does not necessitate language shift. And we can also see the ways that ideological factors influencing identity can determine if children shift to a dominant language or if they maintain multilingualism. So when they identify with the language, even in the absence of grammatical knowledge of that language, this is one factor that can allow for maintenance of linguistic diversity. So thank you so much. The references that I drew on in this, the examples largely came from in Amdo from a work, Amdo Lullaby, which is my first book that will be coming out in October. And then the scholarship that I drew on here is quite extensive in terms of Tibetan studies literature, but also literature on interaction analysis. So thank you so much. I will stop sharing and then perhaps we can have some questions.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for this wonderful presentation and all the video and audio support. It was very interesting to watch it. Yes, let's open the floor to questions. I don't know who would like to initiate. I see many hands clapping.
I have a question, if it's okay. Thanks so much for this presentation. This is really interesting and so great to like see actually these examples of like contextualized play. I just wanted to ask you, in this sort of last slide, you make a sort of hopeful conclusion. You draw some sort of hopeful conclusion about like this code switching being, you know, not the sort of death toll to Tibetan language, but some sort of new communication tools. And yeah, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that, especially like considering the last example that you showed of, is it Bema and Denzin? I forget the kids' names, but the you know, the girl sort of asserting, I want to say this, But
Yeah.
if what she is saying is unintelligible to other Tibetans, how do we sort of think about like, yeah, the creative play of children and their ability to like use language in a creative, exciting way that brings a lot of joy, but also then her sister is saying, I don't know what you're saying, right? And so how can we think of, or how do you, I guess, kind of marry those ideas of
For
creativity,
sure.
but also like the
Yeah.
communicative necessity of language?
Yeah, so I think it's because these children are young enough that explicit instruction in language isn't what they need. And I'm actually I'm working with a Tibetan heritage language school here that takes a really traditional approach to basically teaching the Tibetan alphabet, right? And is very prescriptivist in terms of teaching them grammar. And it simply doesn't work because children create the grammar as they learn language, right? And so the argument that anthropologists are making is that ultimately language ideologies are what drives language change. And I guess that's kind of a broader argument that you have to read a lot of the literature in and look at some more extensive examples. But if you're operating from that premise that it's the ideologies that are driving change in the first place, then the most important thing we can do is help children identify with the language. So help them embrace ideologies that are about the functionality of this language in a wide range of contexts, because then the more context that the language is used in, the greater ability they have to acquire it, right? And the greater presence it has in different contexts, that's ultimately what contributes to language vitality, right? That's the definition of language revitalization, is expanding the context of use of the language. So it's kind of like as soon as you relegate it to like a heritage language context where you can only use it in the classroom, where you can only use it in certain ways, that basically does more harm than good in terms of child language development. Okay, the issue is that society as a whole doesn't really buy this, right? And so you're having it's like even if individual families then can be really supportive of children's play, or if a small community of minoritized language users in a city can be really supportive of using the grammar in new ways and supporting their children in having these flexible linguistic identities, they're still under this pressure from the dominant society to separate out their code use and to basically assimilate to the dominant languages. And that's where it becomes really complicated, where it's like, how realistic is this hope? And I think at the current moment, we do see languages are shifting. At the current moment, we're not seeing extensive revitalization in urban contexts, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I think that especially thinking about the educational context, I know exactly what you mean, right? That if it's a sort of matter of strict adherence to guidelines, like 4-year-olds are not great at that. So that's not really what they're into. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Is that Camille? Yeah, hi, Camille.
Camille, please go ahead.
Ask a question related to that. Do you think that all these discourses about Tibetan language being endangered and also related to the tradition and so on can be a problem for children to identify with the language?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, it depends on the cultural context. And these are different in Amdo, they're very different in Amdo actually, and in exile. And I think, I think it's not necessarily associating it with tradition only. That can hinder children's identification, but it's seeing the language only represented in that context, right? And I think other scholars, though, have looked at language revitalization programs that also frame languages in this way. So especially when Indigenous languages in Canada are seen as the language of elders, that prevents young children from speaking them. But then children are still drawing on cultural knowledge when they choose not to speak the language. And so I think it's an important thing for adults in the community to maybe understand is when children aren't speaking the language, sometimes they're doing that because they have cultural knowledge about the language ideologies. But I think the solution isn't necessarily to say we can't see Tibetan as a form of cultural heritage, but that we just want to expand its uses so that you can have uses of Tibetan that are in religion and in Buddhism and in cultural heritage, and then you can have it represented in other contexts as well, in the context of media, in the context of play. And a lot of educators actually have, like, the most consistent thing I heard in Amdo as well as in Exile is that in the context of education, the biggest problem is that they don't have like support to create enough materials that actually show Tibetan being used in these different contexts, so that all they have to work with is kind of this set of very standardized textbooks that are not visually appealing, that are a little bit boring, and that they don't have resources to create a ton of new media in Tibetan.
Yeah, I don't know if you went to Amdo recently.
The last time was 2018.
Okay, yeah, it became really worse. I mean, I went last year and
Yeah. So when I was there in 2018, there was still context of Amdo Tibetan education happening. Yeah. So maybe that's not the case anymore. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Isabel?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shannon. It's really very interesting. And I like the rigor of linguistic anthropology to look at these phenomena. My question is about another linguistic ideology that we in the West have heard a lot about with Tibetans, which is the Paket Sangma. So speak pure Tibetan. Campaign. It's not a campaign, but like movement, let's say.
Yeah.
So you show how these kids are code switching, and what struck me is the benevolence, the sort of kindness of the parents or the educators around them, not correcting them, not telling them what is Tibetan, what is Chinese or English. So my question is, do you have the impression that there's an age factor to this? Like, I have noticed among Tibetans, usually they don't correct children until very late in age, like 7, 8, then they start to be really strict about behavior. So is there an age factor in tolerating code switching? And then how do you, by 2018, see the relationship between this Paket Sangma movement and actual practice, prevalent practice of code switching?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll talk first about the context in Amdo, I guess, where I did actually see examples of kids being explicitly shamed for using code mixing. And I think the age factor was important. I think context was also really important. So when it was a more formal setting of like education, or we're going to read this book, or we're going to work on our homework together, that was when the parents used a lot more correction. When it was everyday play, there was a lot less of that type of correction. In the exile community, I think it also plays a factor. What I've seen is that by like 7 to 8, a lot of kids realistically are using Tibetan a lot less. So they also are kind of losing the capacity over time. And I think part of that is ideological, because they say like they become embarrassed, right? They become embarrassed that if they're not speaking in the proper way, then they don't even want to try. They don't want to be the one who's like called out in class for saying something incorrectly. So I do think the Paket Sangma movement has been a major factor, like inhibiting children's linguistic continuity. And this person that I was just speaking to, like, I haven't been to Amdo since 2018, but other scholars have also noted this. And someone I was just speaking to this past weekend who'd grown up in their region was remarking about how they switched between Qinghai and Amdo so extensively that they wouldn't even be able to separate out which language is which, right? And which words came from which language. And scholars of language socialization do think that that is the normal process of language acquisition, right? It's not that there are these two separate codes that the children conceptualize in their minds. And so in order to have a stable linguistic ecology, you kind of can't separate out the codes in that way.
Thank you, Shannon. Does anybody else would like to ask a question? I was also thinking about the fact that, for example, in Amdo, Mandarin Chinese and Tibetan, it comes from the same Sino-Tibetan family of languages, correct? And English is very, very different. So these are two different contexts, code switching between English and Tibetan, and code switching between Mandarin Chinese and Tibetan. Do you think that this proximity, to Chinese, at least imaginable, enables kind of bigger, larger code switching in like Amdo rather than in Canada?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, I guess, asking if like the language structures are somehow more related. And actually, so in code switching literature, some scholars have, especially earlier in like the 1950s, 1960s, looked at this, like if a syntax of a language is more similar, does that facilitate a certain type of code mixing? I think two things. One is that it's actually really contested, the historical relationship between Tibetan and Chinese, and the category of Sino-Tibetan is something that I think a lot of, especially Tibetan linguists, really look at Tibeto-Burman as the language family that they're interested in tracing the historical relations through. The other thing is like they're so vastly separated in time and space that I don't think that's a factor, right? Because Tibetan and Chinese don't even have the same word order, right? Chinese and English generally have the same word order, but Tibetan has a different word order than either Chinese or English. So I don't think that's a major factor necessarily, but what I do think is a major factor is like kind of separating out the languages in terms of if Mandarin or English are seen as like the global language that's used in only a certain context or that's used in public. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is that the families in Canada actually had way more extensive code mixing than the families in Amdo. Which is unexpected, right? Because you would think like in Amdo, in Xining, there's much more representation of the Tibetan language in terms of population, even in terms of like public signage, and in terms of, even though it's repressed, like expressions of linguistic difference are more repressed, but there's a greater presence of Amdo than in Vancouver, right? Where there's a couple hundred Tibetans. What I was going to mention is that the Tibetans in Vancouver code mix not just with English, but also with Hindi and Nepali. And even I've had one example of code mixing with Munpa. So I think there's a different type of linguistic history in these communities as well, because they've migrated so frequently.
Thank you. Is there such a thing as like Tibet?
Sorry, one other thing I was going to say. So like in the English examples, I didn't show this one, but I even have examples of kids using compound words that are code mixed. So like one example I had was the word food bank. The child was saying kalak bank. And so there, like the code mixing is more extensive in my material in Vancouver.
It's very interesting. Is there such a thing as like Tibetan Sunday schools, or I don't know, in Vancouver?
Yeah, in Vancouver, they have one. It's a Saturday school. And I think it's only been running since, it's only been running for a couple years. There is one in Vancouver. There are the places with larger Tibetan populations like Toronto and New York have much bigger operations for the heritage language education. And the other thing is in those major centers like in Toronto and New York, the Tibetan population is big enough that kids are actually going to school, public school, with many other Tibetan children, right? So in Vancouver, the population is small enough that each child is still the only Tibetan child in their class. Whereas in New York and Toronto, it's much different. Like there could be a class with 20 Tibetan kids in it.
That's a lot. And how big is the percentage of Tibetan population, for example, in Vancouver, like Tibetan families who decide that their child should go to the school, like, and
It's
Like, are
actually,
there
yeah, so it's actually a lot. Like, so the estimates of like the population, actually, I found this from Isabel's first presentation that had the census data, because I hadn't actually seen that data. So I think it's estimated there are maybe 2,000 Tibetans in British Columbia. Yeah, so anyways,
I'll pull the figure real quick.
okay, perfect. So I was surprised by that number. I think there's 250 or so from Arunachal Pradesh. So a huge number of the Tibetans in British Columbia did come through this one resettlement program. And there's about 50 kids who go to the Heritage Language School. So I think it's quite a bit. It's most of the kids who came through the resettlement program. Some of it also has to do with which monasteries the people go to. So this Heritage Language School is run through one specific monastery. And I think, again, most of the children of the families who go to this monastery participate in the program, but there are 2 other monasteries. Okay, only 715 in BC. Yeah. Okay. And this is throughout the entire province, but the vast majority, from my understanding, are in Metro Vancouver. We have only 3, I think, here in the Okanagan, and then there are some on Vancouver Island as well.
Okay, thank you. Would anyone else be willing to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks for a really interesting and informative talk. I was wondering if you had any like practical advice for people trying to raise bilingual children.
Yeah. So, and I'm really excited you asked that question. I think it kind of goes off of Katie's question. So there's a couple different approaches. The approach that I think has been more traditional has been to have each parent speak one of the languages. So to have like one parent only speak Tibetan and one parent only speak English. The other thing I would suggest is obviously using Tibetan as much as you can in the home, but not necessarily correcting children. So making it fun, like allowing the language to be this kind of game, like where the child issues like playing with the language forms themselves, right? So just allowing the children to be as creative as possible and incorporating that into your own language repertoires as well, right? So if you're playing a game with a child and they are not using Tibetan, you can start code mixing, right? And that kind of helps the child do it as well.
Thank you.
Cool, thank you.
And Shannon? Anyone else? No?
Actually, if I may abuse, I had a technical question. What is the scientific definition of a vulnerable language versus an endangered language?
Yes, that's a great question. So neither of the languages that I've worked with are endangered, because endangered are ones that are no longer required by children as a first language. So it basically is defined based on the extent of disruption to intergenerational transmission. So vulnerable languages have a certain number of speakers, like they're considered a small language minority by the number of speakers, but children would still be learning the language, even though we see shift over time. Whereas endangered languages have no children speaking the language. So essentially the oldest speakers are already adults or older.
Thank you. If no one else has a question, then I would like to sincerely thank Shannon for joining us and for bringing the air of British Columbia to the Spring 2024 lecture series. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and for answering all our questions. And we hope that we will keep in touch, and maybe you will draw more of our Tibetological colleagues from British Columbia to Greece. We would like to continue.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.